I'm Stephen Graham, the scheme's Technical Employer Support Manager, and I'm here to answer some questions about the consultation on extending the employer lock-in rule. The lock-in rule is the name we're using to describe Scheme Rule 23.3. To give a little background, in the run-up to the Scheme Actuary's financial health check in 2017, there was a lot of volatility in the pension scheme's assets. The long-term estimates for investment returns had decreased significantly, meaning the cost for employers and members increased substantially. It became clear that building up new pension scheme benefits was no longer affordable. The lock-in rule was introduced initially for 12 months to avoid any instability while we talked about closing the scheme. It was extended to retain stability up to 30th of June 2019 when the scheme closed. The lock-in rule was extended again, this time to 31st of December 2019, when the scheme closed, to give everyone time to agree the long-term funding and investment strategies. The current consultation is seeking views from employers on whether to extend the employer lock-in rule beyond 2019 or to allow it to end.
Why is there still risk? What are you doing?
The scheme does not currently have enough money to pay member benefits without relying on the scheme's employers. Until we get to a position where there are enough reserves to withstand unexpected shocks, we still need employer support. There are essentially two main options open to the trustee to bridge this gap. The first option is to ask employers to pay extra contributions, and the second option is to rely on investment returns, which can be risky. We understand the strain extra contributions would place on many of the employers that have participated in the scheme, so the trustee has always tried to avoid asking for extra contributions from employers. The trustee is therefore adopting the second option. The investment strategy has to take on some risk, albeit as low as possible. In addition, there is a possibility that medical advances improve life expectancy, meaning the scheme needs to pay benefits for longer. Though this would be great for members, it would mean the scheme needs more money. These investment and life expectancy risks are the two main risks that could have the greatest financial impact to the scheme's finances. The actuary has said they could worsen the scheme's funding position by around £150 million in a bad year. It is worth noting that due to Brexit uncertainty and a global slowdown over the last few months, the scheme's funding position has deteriorated by around £100 million, showing that these risks are real. The trustee is in the process of switching into assets that can better withstand some of the risks that have impacted the funding position in the last couple of months.
So what does this mean?
If the scheme was defined that the assets were less in value than the pension liabilities, we would need to agree a recovery plan, meaning employers would need to pay extra contributions to the scheme. This is the law. It's a statutory obligation and it applies to all employers that haven't been discharged. What this means in practice is that any employer that hasn't triggered and paid their Section 75 employer debt in full would be required to contribute. It is clear that a large number of employers are already locked in as they cannot afford to pay a Section 75 employer debt. Thus, the lock-in rule only really impacts employers that could afford to pay a Section 75 employer debt and leave the scheme. These employers typically have significant financial resources.
Why can't the burden be shared by members?
The law doesn't allow member benefits to be reduced. It requires employers to ensure pension schemes have enough money to pay promised benefits in full.
Is the lock-in really necessary?
When making decisions about the scheme, the trustee must take into account employer covenant. This is essentially the legal obligations and a financial ability each employer has to support the pension scheme now and into the future. The view of the financial strength of the employers affects the value placed on the pension scheme's liabilities and the level of risk that the trustee can afford to take. A guide about employer covenant and why it's important is available on request from Plumbing Pensions. Currently, the scheme's employer covenant is assessed as tending to strong, though this is borderline. If the assessment changed to weak or tending to weak, there is a real possibility that extra contributions would be needed from employers. If there was no lock-in rule, the scheme's largest and strongest employers could pay their Section 75 employer debts and simply notify the trustee in writing that they are ceasing participation. This would discharge them from the scheme. The outcome for the remaining employers would be a weakening of the scheme's covenant assessment, which leads to a very real possibility of extra contributions being required from the remaining employers who may least be able to afford it.
What are the downsides of the lock-in?
The lock-in rule helps to maintain stability and reduce risk. It keeps as many employers as possible in the pension scheme. However, it does not stop insolvent employers from leaving. Even the largest employers can fail, so there will always be a risk that the employer covenant reduces anyway. It does not mean that employers will not be required at some point to pay extra contributions to the scheme. The lock-in rule is just one way to reduce that risk. Currently, if there is a funding shortfall, the trustee can only ask statutory employers to pay extra contributions. That is, any employer that hasn't paid in full their Section 75 employer debt. Let me be clear, the lock-in rule doesn't change this. However, if the scheme's finances deteriorated badly, there is a chance the scheme rules may be changed again to require all employers locked into the scheme to pay contributions above the amounts required by law.
When will the lock-in rule end?
The trustee does not want the lock-in rule to continue any longer than necessary. It is proposing that the lock-in rule ceases when the risks have reduced significantly and the scheme has built up sufficient reserves to withstand unexpected shocks. Until then, there would be annual checks to see whether the lock-in rule is still needed. It's difficult to put a precise time on this as there are so many factors outside the trustee's control. The trustee would like the lock-in rule to stay in place until the scheme reaches what we call a self-sufficient level, where we can run the scheme with very little reliance on employers, with a sufficient buffer to withstand risks. This could be 10 years or more. Taking the above example, if the scheme's funding surplus was £300 million more than it is currently, the lock-in rule would not be required. Most employers in the UK with defined benefit pension schemes are locked in until they can afford to buy annuities for all their members from an insurance company. These are some of the protections brought in by law to protect member benefits. While we would like employers to be able to leave when they want, the lock-in rule may need to remain in place for a long time.
Has the trustee any other options?
The short answer is yes. The trustee is not only focusing on protecting the employer covenant. We are using the scheme assets to invest wisely and capture good opportunities that may arise from time to time. For example, in 2017 we bought a bulk annuity policy and we may purchase more to protect the scheme from the risk of members living longer than expected. We're also reviewing the information we send to members so they fully understand their options when they retire. The scheme needs to hold different levels of reserves depending on the options members choose, so this may have a small impact on the scheme's funding. In addition, over time as members get older, it will become easier to find matching investments and cheaper to buy annuities. As a reminder, the cost of buying annuities directly impacts the value of Section 75 employer debts.
How can I respond?
Send your feedback to Plumbing Pensions by email, phone or in writing using the details on screen by the 22nd of September 2019. We've extended the deadline by a week to give as many employers as possible the chance to respond, including employers who have already responded to us.